So I'm Charles Horioka of Kobe University in Japan, and I've recently been doing a lot of work on bequests and other intergenerational transfers. So I would like to share with you some of my findings today. So the topic of my talk is inequality and bequests. And in particular, I would like to try to answer three questions. The first question is, do people leave bequests? What is the quantitative importance of bequests and other intergenerational transfers? The second question is, assuming people leave bequests, why do they leave bequests? There are a number of possibilities. It could be that they love their children and leave bequests for that reason. Or it could be that they're selfish, don't really care about their children, but they want to induce their children to take care of them during old age, to provide care, visits, phone calls, financial assistance to their children, and they use the bequest as a mechanism for inducing their children to provide this care. And there are other possible reasons as well. So I want to try to get a handle on which of these various motives for bequests are the most important ones. And the third question I want to try to answer is, does it matter whether people leave bequests? So I want to explore the policy implications, and in particular the implications for the intergenerational transmission of wealth disparities, which of course is the overall theme of this lecture series. So without any further ado, let me turn to the first question. Do, in fact, people leave bequests, or to what extent do people leave bequests? And there are a number of methodologies that have been used to get a handle on how important bequests are. The most important one approach is the so-called wealth decomposition studies. Basically, household wealth arises from two sources. One is life cycle saving. You save out of the income that you yourself earn from your job or from your investments. The other source of wealth is bequests and other intergenerational transfers. So broadly speaking, these are the two sources of wealth, household wealth, and this approach simply tries to calculate what is the respective share of these two components. The most well-known paper using this approach is this 1981 paper by Larry Kotlikoff and Larry Summers, published in the Journal of Political Economy. They found that bequests account for 46 to 81% of household wealth. So as much as 4/5 of household wealth is due to bequests and other intergenerational transfers. In response to their paper, the late Professor Franco Modigliani published a rebuttal, and he claimed that they did everything wrong. If you do it right, the share of bequest wealth is only 17 to 20% of household wealth. So there's an enormous range in the estimates that have been obtained. Well, Davies and Shorrocks, they do a survey of the many papers that have been written using this approach, and they conclude that the share of transfer wealth or bequest wealth is perhaps 35 to 45% in the US. So in between the Kotlikoff-Summers estimate and the Modigliani estimate. And they also find that in Canada, the share is roughly comparable. In France, somewhat higher than in the US. And in Japan, perhaps somewhat lower. A number of studies have been done for Japan. And I did one study myself. I found that the share in Japan is only 15 to 18%. So this suggests that perhaps the share is lower in Japan than in other countries. So the conclusion from these wealth decomposition studies is that the share of transfer wealth is non-negligible in all developed countries, on the order of 35 to 45% in the US and Canada, higher in France, maybe lower in Japan. There are probably estimates for other countries as well. I'm not sure about Luxembourg. So the conclusion from this approach is that people do leave bequests, and considerable amounts of bequests, but that the prevalence of bequests varies greatly from country to country. So that's my answer to the first question of whether, my answer from one methodological approach that has been used. There have also been some more survey-type evidence on the importance of bequests. For example, there's a survey that has been conducted for over a number of years by Osaka University, where I used to teach. And in this survey, we asked people in Japan, the US, India, and China about various things, including their bequest motives. And this is what we found, that let's see. That this figure shows the proportion of people planning to leave bequests in these 4 countries. And you can see that this share is non-negligible in all 4 countries, but that there's substantial variation. For example, 87% of people in India plan to leave a bequest. The US is also relatively high, 61%. China, 56%, and Japan is the lowest, 31%, which is consistent with the earlier conclusion from the wealth decomposition studies that perhaps bequest motives are not as strong or as important in Japan. And also consistent that with the this other approach in terms of the U.S. Bequests being perhaps more important in the U.S. So now I want to turn to the second question I want to address, which is, why do people leave bequests? First, I want to talk about the theoretical considerations. I was told not to use too many equations or mathematics, so I'll try to make my presentation as verbal as possible with just 2 or 3 equations. So you probably all know what is the selfish life cycle model. This is probably one of the most widely used models of household behavior in economics. And in this model, we assume, in the simplest version of this model, we assume that people are selfish and that they derive utility only from their own consumption. So P, the subscript P indicates parent. So the utility of the parent is a function only of the consumption of the parent. So they care about how much they themselves consume, but they don't get any utility from anyone else's consumption. So this model, in the simplest form of this model, it predicts that people will not leave bequests because they don't care about their children or how much their children consume. However, there are a number of ways in which the selfish life cycle model can be expanded to explain the existence of bequests. For example, one element that can be introduced is lifespan uncertainty. People don't know for sure when they'll move on to the next world. And so if, unless the market for lifetime annuities are perfect, people may save for precautionary purposes, just in case, just to make sure that they don't run out of money before they pass away. And if they do pass away earlier than expected, they will end up leaving unintended bequests to their children. So this is one explanation for bequests, that people don't really want to leave bequests to their children, but they end up leaving some money to their children because they were saving for precautionary purposes and they passed away earlier than they had hoped. Another explanation for why a selfish person may leave bequests is that they may do it for strategic reasons. There's a famous paper by Doug Bernheim, Andre Schleifer, and Larry Summers that was published in I think it was 1985. They wrote a paper entitled The Strategic Bequest Motive, a very short title. And in this model, they conduct a theoretical as well as empirical analysis to show that people, even selfish people, may leave bequests to their children in order to induce their children to take care of them, to call them more often, to visit them more often. And in fact, their empirical analysis provides confirmation of their theoretical predictions. So let me skip the other variant just for time, due to time considerations. So there are at least two explanations for why a selfish person may leave bequests. It could be due to lifespan uncertainty, or it could be due to strategic considerations. They're a way of inducing their children to provide care during old age. Okay, let's turn to the other commonly used model in economics, which is the altruism model, sometimes also called the Dynasty Model. In this model, people are assumed to be altruistic. So this is my second equation that I'll be showing. UP is the utility of the parents. It's a function not only of their own consumption, but also a function of their children's consumption, or sometimes it's specified as being a function of their children's utility. In either case, people care about their children. They love their children, and they want their children to consume as much as possible. So that's the difference with the selfish model. The altruism model, of course, also has the parent's own consumption as an argument of the utility function, but now it also has the children's consumption as an additional argument in the parent's utility function. So this model, of course, predicts that households will leave bequests to their children because they want their children to be able to consume more. And they'll leave bequests to their children even if they don't get anything in return, even if the children don't provide care during old age, simply because they love their children. And then there's yet a third model. This one I call it the Dynasty Model, although some people use this term to refer to the altruism model, which can get a little confusing. But in any case, my definition of the Dynasty Model is that it's people care about the family line or the family business. The easiest example is the example of a family business. Someone has started a family business that has become very successful, but they're getting old and they won't live much longer. But they don't want their business to go away. So in such a case, it's very often the case that the parent will ask the children to carry on the family business and may leave a bequest to the child to give them an incentive to carry on the family business. So this is another explanation for why people may leave bequests to their children. And so I've presented three theoretical models of household behavior, and now I want to consider in more detail about what the implications of the three models are for bequest behavior and bequest division. So, implication of the selfish life cycle model for bequests is that people will, as I said earlier, will either not leave any bequests at all, will leave only unintended bequests arising from lifespan uncertainty, and or leave bequests only if the children do something in return, such as providing care and assistance during old age. And the implication of this model for bequest division is that the parents will only leave something to the child who actually cares for them during old age, and nothing to their other children. The implication of the altruism model for bequests is that people will leave a bequest to their children even if they get nothing in return. And the implication for bequest division is that people will either divide their bequest equally or perhaps give more to children who have greater needs or less earnings capacity. And the bequest division will not be dictated by how much care and assistance each child provides to the parent. Finally, the third model, the Dynasty Model, the implication of this model for bequests is that people will, of course, leave the bequest to the child only if the child carries on the family business or the family line. And the implication for bequest division is that parents will give the entire bequest to the child who carries on the family line, because that's the reason they're leaving the bequest. So just to summarize my theoretical discussion, each theoretical model has very different implications for bequest motives and bequest division, and therefore we can shed light on which theoretical model applies in the real world by looking at why people leave bequests. And fortunately, this Osaka University survey that I referred to earlier, this survey asked detailed questions about people's bequest motives and bequest division in the 4 countries that were included in the survey: Japan, China, India, and the US. And I've summarized the results in this paper that was published in the Review of Economics of the Household. But just to give you the highlights, this survey, I'm sorry the print is a little bit too small for you to see perhaps, but this survey has 2 questions, one about bequest motives and one about bequest division. And let's see. Oh, okay. So you may have trouble seeing this, but the people were asked what is their attitude toward bequests, and which of these ways of thinking is closest to their own way of thinking. Let me just read you these choices. I plan to leave an inheritance to my children no matter what. That's one. And for example, this one here is, I plan to leave an inheritance to my children only if they provide care during old age. Or I plan to leave an inheritance to my children only if they provide financial assistance. I don't plan to make special efforts to leave an inheritance to my children, but will leave whatever is left over. And this one here is, I plan to leave an inheritance to my children only if they carry on the family business. So you can see that these various, I won't read you all of the possible responses, but you can see that the responses line up very nicely with the 3 theoretical models. There's 2 that are consistent with the altruism model, about 4 that are consistent with the life cycle model, and 1 that's consistent with the dynasty model. And obviously, the response that's consistent with the altruism model, the most consistent with the altruism model is, I plan to leave an inheritance to my children no matter what. And let me just highlight the results for this response. It's the most common response in India and the US. 76% of Indians plan to leave a bequest to their children no matter what, even if they get nothing in return. This figure is 66% in the US and only 32 to 35% in China and Japan. So these figures suggest that Americans and Indians are very altruistic in their bequest behavior, and Japanese and Chinese are very selfish. So what about bequest division? Another question in this Osaka University survey asked people about their bequest division. And for example, I plan to divide my inheritance equally among my children. I plan to leave more to the child who has less earnings capacity. I plan to leave more to the child who has greater needs. These would be consistent with the altruism model, of course. I plan to leave more to the child who lives with me, or who lives near me, who helps me with housework, who provides nursing care, who provides financial assistance. These will be consistent with the selfish life cycle model. These are all strategic bequest motives. And then there are also a couple that are consistent with the dynasty model. I plan to leave more to the child who carries on the family business. Or I plan to leave more to the eldest son or eldest daughter. And it's very often, of course, the eldest son or eldest daughter who carries on the family line. So these 2 would be consistent with the dynasty model. So what about the results? Well, in all 4 countries, the most common response is equal division of the inheritance among the children. But there's considerable variation among the 4 countries in how prevalent this motive is. It's highest in the US. 93% of Americans are planning to divide their bequest equally. 84% of Indians, so very high in both countries, and somewhat lower in Japan and China. Only 70 to 72 or 73% of people are planning to divide their bequest equally among their children in Japan and China. So again, the same conclusion as before, that Americans and Indians have altruistic bequest motives. Japanese and Chinese have selfish bequest motives, or strategic bequest motives. So the overall summary of the survey data is that there's considerable variation among the countries in people's bequest motives and bequest division. The bequest behavior of Americans and Indians is far more altruistic than that of Chinese and Japanese. And I didn't talk much about the results for the dynastic bequest motive, but it's not very important in any country, but somewhat important in Japan and China. So next, let me talk about another type of evidence that sheds light on bequest motives, econometric evidence. There have been a number of studies of the altruistic bequest motive. So people have looked at whether parents really do give more to the more needy children. In other words, whether the share of each child is negatively correlated with their own with that child's own resources. In other words, do parents give more to their poorer children than to their more affluent children? The evidence from this type of test is somewhat mixed. Some people get support for this hypothesis, some people don't. Then there are a number of tests of the strategic bequest motive. The most commonly cited paper is the Bernheim-Schleifer-Summers paper that I referred to earlier. In these studies, the dependent variable is how much care the child provides to the parent, how often they visit the parents or call the parents, or how much nursing care do they give, how much help with housework do they give. And the explanatory variables in these regressions is whether the parent has a bequest motive, or how much money the parent is planning to leave to the children, or how much assets the parents have. Very often you don't know how much the parent is planning to leave as a bequest, but you do know how much money they have. And of course that money is will potentially be left as a bequest, so it can be used as a proxy for the potential bequest that the parent will leave. Bernheim, Schleifer, and Summers, in their 1985 paper, find that children call their parents or visit their parents more often if the parents have more bequeathable wealth. So this is strong evidence of the strategic bequest motive. The Perozic study finds that this effect goes away if you do a more careful analysis. But there have been a large number of studies, and these studies, I won't have time to go into detail about each of these studies, but there's a very good paper by Laferrere and Wolf that surveys the literature on this subject, and they survey about 20 papers that were written for the US and find that two-thirds of them support the altruism model versus the selfish exchange model. So again, the same conclusion as before, that Americans have relatively altruistic bequest motives. However, Laferrere and Wolf find that the majority of studies for France support the selfish exchange model or reject the altruism model. So the French are apparently more selfish in their bequest motives. What about studies for Japan? Well, I did a study in 1994 which found that children are more likely to provide financial assistance to their parents or to live with their parents if the parents have more assets. That supports the strategic bequest motive. And other studies as well. A more recent study that I wrote in 2018 that was published in the International Economic Review, I found that the children are more likely to live with or near their parents, more likely to provide care and assistance to the parents if the parents intend to leave a bequest to their children. So most of the studies for Japan support the strategic or selfish bequest motive. So the conclusion from these econometric studies is basically the same as the conclusion from the survey evidence that I presented earlier, that bequests are motivated partly by altruistic considerations and partly by selfish considerations, and that the nature of bequest motives varies considerably from country to country. And that bequests are motivated by selfish considerations to a much greater extent in France and Japan than in the US. So that's my answer to the second question of why people leave bequests. Now I want to turn to the third question of, does it matter whether people leave bequests? What the policy implications are. Well, one consideration is it matters whether the bequests are requited or unrequited. In other words, whether there's a offsetting transfer in the other direction. In the case of the strategic bequest motive, or the selfish bequest motive, there is a quid pro quo, right? Because the parents are leaving the bequest in order to elicit a certain behavior from the children. And that certain behavior entails transfers, either transfers of money or transfers of time and effort. And of course, time and effort does not involve sort of a out-of-pocket expenditure on the part of the child, but it does entail other costs, the opportunity costs of their time. So in the case of the strategic bequest motive, there is not necessarily a net transfer from the parent to the child because the parent is getting something in return. The simplest case to understand is the case in which the child gives a monthly stipend to the parent and then the parent repays the child by leaving a big bequest to them at the end. In this case, assuming it's an actuarially fair transaction, the transfers in the two directions are equal. The magnitude of the transfers in the two directions are equal. And on balance, there's no net transfer from the parent to the child. So in this case, we don't really need to worry about wealth disparities being passed on to the next generation because although there are gross bequests being made from the parents to the child, the net bequest, the net transfer is zero. But in the case of altruistic motives, of course, there's nothing, no quid pro quo, no offsetting transfer in the other direction. So in the case of altruistic motives, we do have to be worried that these bequests will lead to the intergenerational transmission of wealth disparities. So I'll focus in the remainder of my talk mostly on these altruistic bequest motives that do not involve an offsetting transfer in the other direction. So first, let me look at sort of wealth disparities within households. I presented some figures earlier about bequest division. And if parents are altruistic, they will leave more to children who have greater needs or less earnings capacity. So looking within the household, among the children, bequests will have an equalizing effect, that the poor children, their living standards will be brought up to equal that of their other siblings. So in that sense, altruistic transfers are good for promoting greater equality within the household. The problem is that we also have to look at across households. So if one child has a wealthy parent that leaves them a bequest, another child has a poor parent who doesn't leave any bequest, there will obviously be a transmission of wealth disparities from generation to generation. And there have been a lot of theoretical studies, simulation studies, empirical studies on this issue, and they haven't really reached any definitive conclusion, and I don't have time. I think I'm rapidly running out of time, but many studies find that bequests increase absolute wealth inequality but reduce relative wealth. I've enough time. Okay. So many studies find that bequests increase absolute wealth inequality but reduce relative wealth equality. Because although poor people may get smaller bequests in terms of the absolute amounts, they may receive larger relative bequests. The bequests they receive may be a higher share of their own wealth than in the case of a wealthy person. So we have to be careful about whether we're talking about absolute wealth inequality or relative wealth inequality, and the conclusion may differ depending on which concept of wealth inequality we talk about. So let me just advertise one study that I did with my co-author, Yoko Nimi, who's sitting in the room. So we studied microdata from this Osaka University survey, and we found that first of all, that more affluent individuals are more likely to leave bequests and other intergenerational transfers to their children, and also more likely to invest in their children's human capital, their educational expenses. And so these results, of course, imply that bequests and other transfers have a disequalizing effect on the distribution of household wealth. And we also find that, I think I've accidentally deleted the slide, but there's another finding that in this same paper, that people who receive bequests from their parents are more likely to leave bequests to their children. And so that is further evidence that there's a danger that bequests will promote the intergenerational transmission of wealth disparities across generations. There is a small caveat to that, but I think I don't have time to go into that. So the conclusion regarding wealth disparities is that although there isn't a definitive consensus, that bequests and other intergenerational transfers have a disequalizing effect on the distribution of household wealth, and that bequests promote the intergenerational transmission of wealth disparities. Moreover, Professor Thomas Piketty and others have shown that wealth disparities have been increasing over time in most countries. So it may be desirable to raise bequests and gift taxes, close bequest tax loopholes, or introduce wealth taxes as proposed by Professor Piketty as a way of alleviating the disequalizing effect of intergenerational transfers on the distribution of household wealth. So one implication of bequests is for wealth disparities. A second implication has to do with fiscal policy. I think most of you know about Ricardian equivalence, which basically states that if people are altruistic, fiscal policy will not be effective because people will sort of offset these fiscal policies. For example, let's say the government cuts taxes as a way of trying to promote consumption and stimulate the economy, but finances those tax cuts by the issuance of government bonds. Well, eventually those government bonds have to be redeemed, and the government will have to raise taxes in the future in order to redeem those government bonds. And an altruistic person, a selfish person, would not care because those tax increases will come after they've passed away. But an altruistic person will care about the higher taxes that their children or their grandchildren will have to pay. And so they will try to increase their bequest to offset the higher taxes that their children or grandchildren will have to pay in the future. And as a result of that, they will not increase their consumption even if their taxes are cut. So if people are truly altruistic to that extent, tax cuts will have no impact on stimulating the economy. So it's very important to know whether people are selfish or altruistic when you're formulating fiscal policy, because there will be the effect of fiscal policies will matter very much on whether the nature of people, whether they're altruistic or selfish. And I think it's a little bit preliminary to draw policy implications from my study, but since I find that Americans are altruistic, perhaps tax cuts will not be effective in the US, whereas since the Japanese and Chinese seem to be selfish, perhaps tax cuts will be more effective in those countries. And another implication has to do with income redistribution programs for the elderly. Well, many countries have old age pensions, health insurance, long-term care insurance for the, to ensure that the elderly have an adequate standard of living. And these programs will be effective if people are selfish, but they will be ineffective if people are altruistic, because, well, assuming that these programs, of course, are unfunded or pay-as-you-go, because an altruistic person, let's say an altruistic person suddenly can receive a pension or long-term care benefits. They'll be very happy about that, of course, but then they'll realize, wait a minute, but these will be financed by my children's taxes. I've got to compensate my child by leaving them a larger bequest, so they will save the entire pension and leave it to their child, and so the pension will not have any effect on raising the living standards of the older generation. So again, when designing income redistribution programs, you also have to be very careful about whether people are altruistic and selfish, because the impact of these programs will be very different depending on the nature of human behavior. So that's basically all I wanted to say, but let me just briefly summarize my main conclusions. My answer to the first question, do people leave bequests, is yes. People leave substantial bequests and other intergenerational transfers to their children in all countries, but the quantitative importance of bequests and other intergenerational transfers differ considerably from country to country. My answer to the second question, why do people leave bequests? Well, people leave bequests for a variety of reasons. Some people for altruistic reasons, some people for selfish reasons, some people for dynastic reasons, and some people, there are other motives which I didn't have time to discuss. But the altruistic motives and the selfish or strategic motives appear to be the dominant motives in most countries, but their relative importance varies greatly from country to country. My answer to the third question, does it matter? Yes. Whether and why people leave bequests and other intergenerational transfers to their children has important implications for the intergenerational transmission of wealth disparities, for the effectiveness of fiscal policy, and also for these income redistribution programs for the elderly. So studying people's bequest behavior is important, not only because it's an interesting intellectual exercise, but also because it has wide-ranging policy implications. Thank you very much for your kind attention.